Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuh. So I have the last class for tonight, and alhamdulillah, I'm really happy that we're speaking to this topic. Let me begin by saying that what is unfolding in Palestine is another Nakba. It is another disaster. It is another catastrophe. And it is crucial as Muslims in the United States, American Muslims, that we make sure that we are not cowed into silence by the corporate media and venal politicians. It's very important that we understand that our loyalty, first and foremost, is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the universal message that He revealed in the Quran and to the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. And don't let anyone tell you that there is some type of inherent conflict between being a devout Muslim and being a citizen of the United States of America. But again, I want to emphasize this point that our loyalty is first and foremost to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And to understand that when we speak up about this crisis, this tragedy, this Nakba, that we are using the appropriate language to describe what we are witnessing, because we have governmental bodies, we have politicians, we have a corporate media that is seeking to erase the truth of what is happening in Palestine and Palestine. And because fiqh laqalliyat, because minority fiqh is about language and concepts and ideas, let's make sure, dear sisters and dear brothers, that we get the language right. Let's use Quranic and prophetic language to describe the sacred geography of Palestine. Jerusalem, of course, is the name that is widely known as the name of the city that is holy to all three Abrahamic faiths. But there is a name in the Islamic tradition. Let's use that name. Bayt al-Maqdis, al-Quds, al-Haram al-Sharif. It's not called Temple Mount, period. Language and framing matter, because these are Muslim lands that belong to a Palestinian Muslim majority until European Jewish immigration artificially changed the demographics. My second point, before I get into the topic here, is that this tragedy it calls upon us to read the Quran again and again. Remember those three principles that I mentioned earlier in my presentation that the late Dr. Taha Jabir Alwani reminded us about, reading the Quran within that framework of Tawheed, Tazkiyah, and Umran, looking at the Quranic concepts in the light of monotheism, purification of the self and the society, and life and civilization. So when we read the Quran is telling us about events that took place in the past, and it's also telling us about what is happening now in our current time as well as the future. Understand that when pre-modern scholars read ayahs in the Quran, they had no sense of that there would be an establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. They had no sense of an impending Nakba. So understand that the Quran is not a book that's locked into the past. When we read, for example, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم سبحان الذي أسرى بعبده ليلا من المسجد الأقصى or من المسجد الحرام إلى المسجد الأقصى الذي باركنا حوله لنريه من آياتنا إنه هو السميع البصير. When we read that verse in the Quran, glory be to the one who took his servant Muhammad by night from the sacred mosque to the farthest mosque, whose surroundings we have blessed so that we may show him some of our signs. Indeed, he alone is the all-hearing, all-seeing. You have to understand that we are reading this ayah after 1400 years of history. We are reading this ayah after we have witnessed Palestine being safeguarded under Muslim rule and then being subjected to oppression under the Zionist regime. So the Quran, these moments are literally calling upon us to read the Quran and to renew our commitment to a holistic reading of our sacred text. Now to the topic at hand, the connection between the fiqh of minorities and what's happening in Palestine today. And some of the questions that have arisen for us in terms of what is the approach that we should take? How do we process this? And how do we respond as Muslims who find ourselves, frankly, buying into a system that is funding genocide? Do we have any responsibilities towards our brothers and sisters in Palestine? And what are our responsibilities, frankly, towards our fellow countrymen and countrywomen? And let me say this, that the situation really exemplifies that hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he likened the ummah to a body. That if one part of the body is afflicted, that the rest of the body is not able to rest. The rest of the body stays awake with sleeplessness and fever. This situation, as Sheikh Suleiman noted a few minutes ago, has really revealed certain things. Allah Ta'ala is revealing the true nature of so many people and organizations and entities, that the mask has really come off. Because I am finding myself, and I would imagine some of you, or maybe you understand where I'm coming from, I've had people in my community tell me this, that something changed in terms of how we are interacting with the larger society. You know, that we had certain assumptions there, certain assumptions that perhaps we as American Muslims had kind of moved on or transcended some of the Islamophobia that was immediately kind of attendant to 9/11. We noticed that left, sort of progressive, like circles amongst the progressive left were actively courting Muslims. We noticed that we were forming alliances with various progressive groups. We noticed that the Democratic Party even seemed kind of open to having Muslim operatives. We noticed, for example, in the realm of popular culture, that we were seeing greater representation of Muslims, whether it's in, Marvel, a Marvel movie, or whether it is, something on some type of mainstream, some show on mainstream media. I remember reading quite a few stories about programs that were coming out featuring kind of storylines about Muslims, not really practicing Muslims, but they were still people who identified as Muslims. So I think for some of us, there is a sense that, maybe we've transcended some of these difficulties post 9/11, and we are garnering increasing acceptance amongst our, our fellow countrymen and countrywomen. And then the events of October 7 take place. And then we're going into settings that we were in before, again, going to work, school, what have you. And all of a sudden, people are quiet, or there's this tension, or there's just like the elephant in the room, which is that we, as Muslims that are part of this global Muslim ummah, we are hurting. And every single day that we wake up, we are dealing with the guilt, the immense guilt that we feel that because we are safe and secure and enjoying all these luxuries, so many luxuries that we take for granted, while our brothers and sisters in Palestine, as I speak, there are countless people buried underneath the rubble. The death toll, I think, is at 25,000 plus. and then the tens of thousands that have been injured and wounded, and the millions that are displaced. And we are seeing all of this, like this is happening live. It's unfolding on our social media feed, and then we are around people in the larger society and they're just oblivious. So these are experiences that all of us are navigating. And now we have to reckon with this question that at least that I have, that might be foremost in the minds of some of us here, hopefully many of us, that what do we do about this gap? Because again, we thought we'd arrived, and now then October 7 happens, and all of a sudden, we are being, in many quarters, demonized for supporting and standing in solidarity with Palestine. So let's go now to the model, this model, because the model of the fiqh of minorities is important, because it's a model that, remember, was sort of, it was really kind of conceptualized to afford Muslims immigrating to the US and Europe the ability to be able to integrate into those societies on an Islamic basis. That's the whole idea behind the idea of fiqh al-aqalliyat. The large numbers of Muslims going to the United States and Europe and encountering all the different scenarios that the scholars earlier have spoken about. And one of the revolving concerns or recurring concerns in those writings is how to equip Muslims to be good and productive citizens. Well, let me tell you this. We have been good and productive citizens for a long time, all right, for decades. Going back to, let's see, so let's do some trivia here. When did the first Muslims actually come to this country? Anyone know? I'm sorry? 1880, so the brother here says 1880. Who else? Okay, immigrants. Yes, brother. Okay, so before Europeans came here, during the age of discovery or exploration, there was a sister who was speaking. Yes. Yes, absolutely. So this question of citizenship, I think we need to take it back a little bit further. We need to go beyond the 1960s, and we need to actually examine, right, as the sister is saying here, and the brother as well, that we have, again, established Muslim presence in this country, people who were brought here against their will, and these people, their labor was exploited in order to create the foundation for the superpower the United States is going to become. So to me, to be very honest with you, I think the question of citizenship really was revolved a long time ago, because Muslims helped to build the United States of America. Now, having said that, we still have the reality that probably a lot of people in this room, that perhaps you immigrated to the United States or your parents or grandparents did. And as our scholars indicated earlier, right, even though this is a history that I kind of feel connected to that early Muslim past because my parents converted, the reality is that a lot of folks are grappling with sort of this gap between the values they bring from Muslim majority cultures and sort of how their kids and sort of attitudes their kids are adopting. So let's go back to the fiqh of minorities to see what it attempts to do for Muslims living in the West and how we can connect it to our obligations vis-a-vis our Muslim brothers and sisters in Palestine. So I'm going to give you, there are basically 7 objectives. I'm going to give you 6 of them. I think the first 6 objectives really kind of relate to the topic. And these are the objectives that Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, rahimahullah, outlines in his book. So as I mentioned, he has a book called The Fiqh of Minorities. But before that, there is the very famous Al-Halal wal-Haram fil Islam, or The Lawful and the Prohibited in Islam, a very famous book, where he articulates this idea, then he kind of develops it later on. So, according to Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, Fiqh al-Aqalliyat attempts to achieve 7 objectives. And again, I have 6 of them here. The first one is to help Muslim minorities lead a wholesome life. And he defines that in terms of the individual, families, and the community. So looking at Palestine, we have to decide what constitutes a wholesome life for us as Muslims. Is it to be comfortable? Is it to be financially successful? Is it, to be kind of ensconced in the suburbs, enjoying, again, the amenities that we enjoy as an affluent community? What does it mean to lead a wholesome life, I think, is the first question. The second objective that Sheikh al-Qaradawi identified was that fiqh al-aqalliyat helps Muslim minorities maintain the essence of their Islamic identity. So for him, this is not about making too many concessions or accommodations. He's not arguing that we should kind of water down who we are as Muslims, but for him, having a fiqh or framework of fiqh that was more expansive allowed Muslims to sort of retain the core of their Islamic identity. In reality, looking at the situation in Palestine has helped us, I think, to achieve this goal. And I think someone said this, I've seen this on social media, this idea that it's not, help me with this quote, especially the young people, you probably remember better than me, but it's not that we are somehow saving the Palestinians, that they've really rescued our faith, our iman. Because now we are looking at the Palestinians and we are being forced to translate what we read in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ to real life. Iman, Yaqeen, Tawakkul, Qana'a, contentment, like all these become very real when you look at the Palestinians. For example, Ruh al-Ruh, that amazing grandfather. I mean, these are images that we will never forget. And it's the Palestinian Muslims that are telling us what it means to be a Muslim at your very core. The third objective that Sheikh al-Qaradawi identifies, that in his view, he says, a fiqh of minorities empowers Muslims to invite their fellow citizens to Islam in the best way, using the best language. Now, this situation has, again, it's posed certain challenges for us because I think many of us, most of us, are extremely angry, to say the least. We are upset, we are shocked, saddened, angry, frustrated. There's just sort of an array of emotions. And for a lot of us, especially I think for young folks, you want to kind of give voice to those emotions. So now we actually have to look within ourselves and ask ourselves, how would the Prophet ﷺ react to being insulted, for example? What would he say if someone were trying to antagonize him? Is it appropriate, for example, that if we are going to a protest or a march or some type of civil action, is it appropriate for people to use foul language, for example? These are things that we actually have to grapple with when we think about the type of activism that we want to do and what it means to invite people to Islam through our conduct. Because in reality, even though it might seem like going to a sit-in, a protest, a city council meeting, which I literally did for the first time in my life, just not too long ago. Again, I'm teaching at a seminary. To be very honest with you all, quite detached from this type of involvement in the local community. And then I realized that all of us have a responsibility in whatever capacity to raise our voices and to do things that are frankly very uncomfortable. Again, I'm not mentioning myself as an example, but I am saying that if someone like me could be forced out of her comfort zone, I hope it would be easier for the people in this audience who I think are more connected to this type of work. And at that meeting, for example, I was looking at sort of the spectrum of responses. You had people who were in dhikr, people who were remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, people who tried to remain grounded, and you had people who were very, very upset. And I realized that our presence and the way that we conducted ourselves was a form of da'wah, even though it was very tempting to be angry and to sort of lash out at the council members who would not really even acknowledge us. That we have the ayah in the Quran, for example, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. قُلْ هَذِهِ سَبِيلِي أَدْعُو إِلَى اللَّهِ عَلَى بَصِيرَةٍ أَنَا وَمَنِ اتَّبَعَنِي وَسُبْحَانَ اللَّهِ وَمَا أَنَا مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ. So we have in Surah Yusuf, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, say, O Prophet, i.e. to the people, this is my path, this is my way. I am inviting to God with insight. I am those who follow me. And glory be to God, and I am not of those who associate partners with God. So we have to actually look at these moments, dear brothers and dear sisters, as an opportunity to convey who we are. Because there's a lot of propaganda about our community right now. Again, echoes of 9/11. And I think as all of you are aware, there are people, and we're seeing these shahada stories again on social media, there are people who are actually flocking to Islam because of the resilience of the Palestinians and the fact that they are exemplifying values of courage, of conviction, of faith, of reliance, of strength that people have frankly never witnessed before. And even though we are very far removed from what our brothers and sisters are experiencing, we should try to, as much as we can, replicate and uphold that dignity that the Palestinians are demonstrating to the entire world. Now, back to this model again. Point number 1 was that fiqh al-aqalliyat can help Muslims to lead a wholesome life. 2, to retain the core of our identity. 3, to invite people using appropriate language that resonates with them to Islam. And 4, here Shaykh al-Qaradawi says that fiqh al-aqalliyat is about what he calls a disciplined flexibility. And this is very important because as we look at the options in front of us for how we engage with the larger society on the issue of Palestine, we do have to exercise caution. And he talks about a disciplined flexibility, and what that means is that we have to be strategic about who we lend our support to, about the voices that we amplify. You know, there are people whose voices are being amplified, and they are sort of presenting their views on Palestine. And I think in most cases they're well-intentioned, but they're not Palestinians. And it's very important that we make sure that we are amplifying the voices of the people who are experiencing this catastrophe, who are living through it, and it can actually give us that experiential knowledge of what it means to be a Palestinian, whether it is in Palestine or in diaspora. You know, this disciplined flexibility also tells us that we have to be very careful in terms of political alliances. And this has become, I think, very difficult after October 7. I'm going to come back to this point. Because again, the fiqh al-aqalliyat is looking at how to be good citizens. It's looking at how we can integrate. So Shaykh al-Qaradawi calls this a delicate balance. Remember I said earlier, it's a bit of a balancing act, right? He says it's a delicate balance of open conservation and integration without assimilation. All right, so we're religious, and we espouse the values of our religion, but we also have a certain degree of tolerance for our countrymen and countrywomen, right? He says that we integrate without assimilating. And all that is done with, again, that disciplined flexibility. But I'm going to stop and talk more about this particular point, because we have to now ask ourselves, are there limits to integration? Because I think some of us thought that, okay, we were really kind of entering into the mainstream. Prior to October 7, we could point to polls or surveys that showed an increasing number of Americans expressing favorable views towards Islam and Muslims. Right? In fact, ISPU, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, actually did some work around sort of Muslim and Jewish relations in America and found a bit of a sort of a, I don't know, some alignment there. And the events of October 7 have really kind of thrown these tensions, I think, into sharp relief. You know, as someone that was involved in interfaith work for many years, one of the things that I found, I don't know if I want to say it's surprising, because Allah Ta'ala tells us a lot about engagement with Ahl al-Kitab in the Quran, but I will say this. One of the things that I found dismaying was that when I went to that city council meeting to speak in favor of a resolution calling for a ceasefire, which they wouldn't even listen to, but when I went to the city council meeting, there were people there from the Jewish community that prior to October 7 had, well, I guess, now that I think about it, had really kind of looked at the Muslim community as kind of like their token diversity kind of, I don't know, representatives or what have you. In other words, I realized that our engagement was not really strategic. It might have satisfied sort of these ideas about let's all sit together and talk about commonalities. It might have ticked off a diversity kind of check mark or whatever. But I saw at that meeting very clearly what are the limits of integration. As people that I actually had sat across a lunch table with were there basically denouncing our community. So we have to ask ourselves, what does integration mean to us? You know, let me share this anecdote with you all. I've mentioned a few times that I'm the daughter of converts. And people are surprised to hear that, because they just assume, okay, if she has an Arab background, how is that possible? But on my father's side, my great-grandfather came from what is today southern Lebanon when it was under the Ottoman Caliphate, and they were Syrian Orthodox in their faith. So my mother converted first, and she's African-American than my father. So when they converted to Islam in the 1970s, just to give you all a sense of how this debate has shifted, they weren't interested in being integrated. I mean, they were already born and raised here, several generations actually. And to them, the idea of voting was anathema. Like, you did not talk about that. There was no interest in being part of the system whatsoever if you went back to the 1970s and talked to my parents. Moreover, they were reading publications from the Muslim world that described voting as a type of disbelief or shirk. And those pamphlets would often bring the ayah in the Quran, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. And those that do not govern by what God has revealed are disbelievers. So that was their orientation as new Muslims. Fast forward half a century later, and we would argue that we are now more sophisticated when it comes to this issue. So for example, in 1994, the Fiqh Council of North America, under the leadership of Sheikh Taha Jabr Alwani, issued a fatwa. And it really was a very significant one, because that 1994 fatwa allowed Muslims in America to vote on a shari'i basis. So again, today we have the manifestations of that. We have a number of Muslims who have run for office, or they're currently in office, and in today's climate, we even have Muslims who are saying they will not be bought to run against people like Rashida Tlaib in Congress, the only Palestinian there. And by the way, I'm not saying this as kind of critique of these developments. To me, it's just really fascinating, but we have to consider, with all the progress that we've made as a community. And by the way, we can also make the argument that it was the Muslim vote that made the difference for Biden in swing states like Michigan, which he carried by only 2.78%. Where are we today? All right, the very democratic establishment in which we put our faith and our trust is literally funding a genocide against the people of Palestine, with the incumbent even questioning the mounting number of civilian deaths in the early days of the assault on Gaza. Now, back to the objectives of Sheikh al-Qaradawi. And that was, again, number 4, this idea of integration. Let's look at number 5. One of the objectives of Fiqh al-Aqalliyat is to inform Muslims about their constitutional rights to religious, political, social, and economic freedom. So again, it's to inform Muslims about constitutional rights that allow Muslims to practice freely, to associate with others, to express political views, to secure their livelihood. And let me comment about that one briefly. I think now more than ever, as a community, when it comes to our response to what is happening in Palestine, we definitely need to make recourse to the Constitution. Because we have to understand something about that document. That document is, to be honest, it's quite aspirational in the sense that it contains certain ideals, but as any African American could tell you, there has been often a gaping chasm between those ideals and the reality of being an oppressed minority in the context of the United States. Congress passed a resolution not too long ago describing the slogan "From the river to the sea" as a form of anti-Semitism. I believe the resolution also said that anti-Zionism was anti-Semitism. So this is certainly the time not to be docile citizens who just want to be comfortable in the suburbs, but to be those people that are going to look at the example of the indigenous people in these lands and African Americans and say that we are going to be that community that actually holds this country to its espoused values as enshrined in the Constitution. I think that should be the role of the Muslim community in the United States of America. Now, you may ask, shouldn't we just throw up our hands and say we're going to go elsewhere? All right, some of you might be saying, has the dichotomy between Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, has it really kind of come into play again with what's happening in Palestine and the role that this government is playing in funding a genocide? Should hijrah be a viable option for our community? For that particular question, I will defer to the other scholars that are here, but I will give you my perspective on this. And my perspective, again, if you want a fatwa, talk to the other scholars, but if you want my perspective, I will say this. Your presence in the United States is not a mistake, dear brothers and dear sisters. It is not an accident of history. You are not here because you got a scholarship, or you went to a great school, or you've got a high-paying job, or you found someone to marry. That's not why you're here. Think about the prophetic hadith about hijrah and the definition of the actual true muhajir, the one that makes migration to God and his messenger. We have to understand that there were Muslims that were here a long time ago whose Muslim identity was taken from them by force. And they did their best to retain it. They left behind books and writings that told us they did their best to the end of their lives to proclaim that they were Muslims. We're not living under that type of duress. So again, my response to the question of hijrah is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wrote for a particular reason that Muslims would be here in the United States of America at this time. We should think about that and examine that. Now, inshallah, as I move to conclude this portion, and inshallah we go to Q&A, let me say this. Sheikh al-Qaradawi also talks about the objective of Fiqh al-Aqalliyat as helping Muslims to discharge, to fulfill their religious, social, and cultural obligations, to where religion is a guide for them and not an obstacle. I.e., we don't see religion as a stumbling block. We see religion as providing that clarification that is sorely needed. you, dear brothers and dear sisters, you have the ability to be the voice of the oppressed. You have the ability to call people to the carpet. You have the ability to hold people to account. You have the ability to push back against the propaganda of the Zionist entity. You have the ability to do that. And when Shaykh al-Qaradawi writes about obligations, yes, he means the personal obligations of ibadah and worship, certainly. And being in the masjid and building institutions, absolutely. But remember, we are here for a reason beyond just kind of focusing on our individual worship. And please don't think I'm being dismissive, because at the end of the day, if we want to go out and engage in activism and we can't pray and we don't know what tahajjud is and we don't have salawat and dhikr, then we need to ask ourselves, what is the basis for our activism? But we have to understand this point about the idea of taklif within the Islamic tradition, the idea of obligation, and where does it actually derive from? So in books of Islamic law, you'll see that time and time again, when the jurist discusses prayer, for example, or fasting, or pilgrimage or zakah, they will always go back to the idea of the person who is mukallaf. And who's the mukallaf person? The mukallaf person is Muslim, baligh, aqil, hur. Those are the criteria. And you know what? We can translate that to our circumstances. Believers who are of age, they've attained to maturity, of sound mind, and they possess their freedom. Every single day that Allah Ta'ala blesses you to get up and you enjoy safety and peace and security, you can act. And remember, these obligations that become fard on us when we are of age and so on, these obligations are individual obligations. But remember, the discussion of fard ayn is never far removed from fard kifaya, from communal obligation. In fact, if you look at every single ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses the believing person, is always in the plural, Ya ayyuhal ladina amanu. It is always in the collective. So back to that last point from Shaykh al-Qaradawi about empowering Muslims to discharge their obligations. Remember, those obligations are communal, they are societal. There's an ayah in the Quran, and I'm going to say this ayah. Again, you're familiar with it, but it behooves us to reflect on this ayah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas. Ta'muruna bil ma'ruf wa tanhawna 'anil munkar wa tu'minuna billah. وَلَوْ آمَنَ أَهْلُ الْكِتَابِ لَكَانَ خَيْرًا لَهُمْ مِنْهُمُ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ وَأَكْثَرُهُمُ الْفَاسِقُونَ. It's chapter 3, verse 110. You are the best community raised up for humanity. You enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong and believe in God. If only the people of the scripture had believed, it would have been better for them. Among them are believers, but most of them are defiantly disobedient. You might look at the ayah in the Quran and you might say, you know what, I really feel like as a community, as an ummah, we've fallen short. So I want you to understand something. This ayah is a declaration of sentiments, of aspirations. In other words, Allah Ta'ala is telling us this is the standard, this is the criterion. And if we are asking ourselves what to do, where to go, what are the next steps to take, go back and look at this ayah in the Quran, and Allah Ta'ala is telling us what we need to do. So my advice in the context of Palestine is, let's be that ummah that's described in the Quran. Because see, the Palestinians they've already exemplified for us what it means to be on that level. Now we have to figure out in our context how we can emulate them. And it starts with the obligations that we have to each other as Muslims, as believers, and the obligations we have to inform our fellow countrymen and countrywomen, and the obligation that we have to not be cowed into submission or silence by whether it's the current administration, whether it's Congress, or whether it is the various Islamophobic elements out there. As Muslims, like I said, our loyalty first and foremost is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what He calls us to, which is enjoining what is right and forbidding the wrong. So with that, I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to alleviate the suffering of the Muslims in Palestine. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept them as shuhada. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to raise us with the oppressed and the shuhada on the day of judgment. And I ask Allah ta'ala to not raise us amongst the oppressors. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Jazakumullah khair. As usual, some excellent questions. I'm sure a lot of people feel this way, this sense of hypocrisy and survivor's guilt. Are we hypocrites for supporting Palestine but not caring about, this person particularly said Native American displacement in America, but really any cause for any minority or anyone that has suffered throughout the world? And right now, while we say this, we also pray for for our brothers and sisters in Sudan as well, who have been going through their catastrophe calamity as well.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So, no, I don't think that makes us hypocritical. I think that the reality is that for those that immigrated to this country, that you perhaps came to the United States to avail yourselves of certain opportunities. And that's not inherently wrong or unethical to want a better life for yourself, for yourselves, for your families. I mean, my great-grandfather immigrated because, based upon family lore, things were not going too well during that time under the Ottomans, and they wanted to come to the United States. They came here as Christians, obviously, but like I said, my father converted in the 1970s. So this is what I would say. Do not become complacent. So I want you to benefit from the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you in terms of peace, safety, security, livelihood, family, community. Benefit from these things that you enjoy, but do not be lulled into complacency to where we fall into the fallacy of thinking that people are oppressed because of something they did, i.e. because of it's some fault of their own. And we're and sadly, this is what people are saying about the Palestinians. So somehow they must have brought this on themselves. No, they didn't. So I think it's just being aware of the history of the founding of this country. So this is an opportunity to actually reflect on what are the common threads between sort of Zionism and white supremacy. What are the common threads between Israel as a settler colonial state and the history of the United States of America? This might be a good opportunity to educate your children, learn about the indigenous peoples, learn about their experiences. See if there are da'wah efforts. There are Muslims amongst Native Americans. See what outreach you can do, for example. So, and I'm not saying this as a way to kind of like assuage any guilt. I'm saying that, again, we're only human. As individuals, these issues seem overwhelming, but as a Muslim ummah, if we are united in terms of a unified, consistent stance against oppression, I think this goes a long way in allowing us to actually stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to say that we cared about people in their circumstances, whether they were a Muslim or non-Muslim, that we cared about the oppressed and the downtrodden. That we realized that because we enjoyed certain blessings in the United States, we had even more of an obligation to care about these communities. And yes, to the point about Sudan, absolutely. Everywhere we look, the ummah is suffering. And we are not centralizing Palestine to the exclusion of other Muslims and other Muslim communities. But again, Palestine obviously has certain theological and spiritual significance for us. And that's why I mentioned the ayah in the Quran. And moreover, the situation in Palestine, I think, is unique because this this goes back 100 years. You should look at Dr. Rashid Khadidi's book, 100 Years' War. This goes back 100 years. And honestly, the reason why we are feeling this as deeply as we are, it's because of the historical memory that all of us carry, knowing that what we are seeing in Palestine today is the unfolding of a vast conspiracy to end Muslim political power. And it starts 100 years ago with the Europeans.
So, how do we, as a new, brother or sister asks, as a new Muslim, how much attention and love should I develop for Palestine as a nation and hatred for Israel as a nation? Is this an essential topic to talk about with my family? And then another question is, should this discussion be a focus when it comes to da'wah?
So when it comes to family members, it really depends. If the family members are non-Muslims, again, you want to start with just basic humanity. That all of us should care about this issue, Muslim or not. That all of us should care about this issue because of basic decency and humanity. Now, if they are evangelical Christians, you're going to have to dig deeper, because some of the biggest proponents of Zionism are evangelical Christians. So you really are going to have to study the scripture, i.e. from the source, to be able to refute the claims they're making about Palestine. Let me clarify something here. This is not about hating the state of Israel. This is not what this is about. We as Muslims hate oppression and violence and terrorism against innocent people. That is what we condemn. And this is also not about Muslim versus Jew. I have to clarify this point as well, because you will read, for example, a hadith that will talk about the end times. And people will sometimes misapply these ahadith. The ahadith that talk about those tensions, they are not telling you to hate people because they are Jewish, for example. That's not what the hadith says. The ahadith are describing events that will happen around the end times, to where as Muslims, we are called upon to identify who are the followers of Masih ad-Dajjal, the Antichrist. So these ahadith are focusing on choices and theological stances that people are taking, not some inherent hatred for people because of their ethnicity or religion, not at all.
Do you think that showing anger without foul language can be useful? For example, Rahma's confrontation with the CNN reporter at the Rafah border, which garnered a lot of attention because of that honesty and urgency.
I think there's a distinction between anger, that is righteous indignation, which I think is fully appropriate and to be expected under the circumstances, versus going too far. And by the way, I'm not critiquing the response of anybody in that situation. To be very clear, I'm talking about us here, that if you as a young Muslim go to a protest or a meeting and you're dropping F-bombs all over the place, that's what I'm talking about, to be very kind of specific about things. And I'm seeing the usage of a lot of foul language amongst Muslims. And again, I know people are angry. I know you're fed up and disgusted, but we have a better way, a better vocabulary, and a better method than using that type of language. That's what I'm getting at, because when the anger becomes incoherence, you're going to lose your audience. Wallahu a'lam.
Does Israel deserve our da'wah? Do we want to see them accept Islam?
So that's a really tough question that, honestly, you've put me on the spot with that question, and I'm reluctant to answer that question just because I believe that we have gone beyond the point of da'wah. We are talking about an existential threat to the Palestinians, and I understand there are some pacifist voices out there amongst the ulama. And yes, it would be lovely if the Israeli government would agree to kind of abide by all the different treaties and conventions, but they're not acting in good faith. This is just my opinion, by the way. I'm not representing anybody when I say this, but I do think that da'wah necessitates some goodwill on the part of the other party or the other group, and I don't see that. When people are openly calling for genocide, I would genuinely have to ask myself and the brothers and sisters here, how do you talk to that person about embracing Islam? Of course, Allah Ta'ala works miracles. Allah Ta'ala can change hearts. There are people who were Zionists that actually thought about things and saw through that propaganda and actually embraced the cause of the Palestinians. So I think it's possible to ask Allah Ta'ala to change hearts, but we also have to understand the nature of this conspiracy. And again, these are my views. Let me be very clear about this. We are dealing with something very Dajjalic about what's unfolding. When we look at the propaganda, when we look at the language being used, when we look at kind of the actions being sort of enacted by the Zionists and those that support them, there's something very Dajjalic in all of this. Keep that in mind.
So what about when participating in marches and protests that might be organized by groups who their thought process or their beliefs do not align with ours? When it comes to, the dream, the inshallah, not just the dream, but inshallah, the reality of freeing Palestine. For example, groups that advocate for different moral standards than we abide by like LGBT, but they're hosting a rally for Palestine. What should be our response? Are we allowed to go to them? And then what happens when they scratch our back, we scratch theirs?
Absolutely. So, again, we were we aligned with various progressive groups because we felt, okay, we have a home amongst those groups. And as Sheikh Suleiman and others noted, it kind of came with there was a bit of a price tag there. So I think we just have to be clear that when it comes to this issue of Palestine, this is an issue of humanity. So I personally do not see any Shari'i kind of objection to being there at those marches, protests, and rallies, so long as you are not being asked to kind of elevate a lifestyle that goes against the Sharia. That's my view of it. But to kind of be there just kind of in solidarity with fellow humans, I personally do not see the objection to that. Because at the end of the day, I, as a believer, I want people to actually be guided to Allah Ta'ala through this activism. Does that make sense?
What about this other sister asks, my friends, non-Muslim and Muslims, are being harassed by Zionists at school for protesting, for supporting Palestine. But whenever they report the harassment, the school brushes it off as a difference of opinion. What can they do?
I think that they need to continue to document what's happening, and I would suggest to this person, inshallah, if you speak to me privately, I can probably give you some resources for how to properly kind of document and report harassment and bullying, because it may be to where if the school is just dismissive and they're not doing their job, you have to either take it to the next level of school governance or perhaps bring in an advocacy organization if that is what is happening.
Yeah. The documenting is extremely important. You write down the date, you write down the time that it happened, and you keep it recorded. You're not going to get anywhere by just saying they keep doing this and then write down everything and get an advocacy group going, for example. So, final question, inshallah, for the night. And I wanted just to ask you personally, how have the past 2.5 months impacted you, Sister Zaynab, and how has it changed you?
That's a great question, and again, I would not normally speak about this, but I was asked the question, so I referenced it in my presentation. So I went to the city council meeting, and the reason why I'm emphasizing this is that I've never been involved in local politics. One, for lack of time, and the other just because I really didn't have interest in going to meetings that I thought were just very boring meetings about administrative matters, and what's the point? And then I realized that while I cannot impact what happens in the White House or at the UN or certainly in occupied Palestine as much as I would like, what I can do is leave the comfort of my home and go to this meeting. So what changed for me, Dr. Muhammad, was that I decided that I wanted to go to the meeting and see what it was like, because I really had no sense of what it was like in terms of the local government and city councils. So I think I went to 3 meetings. One was at the level of the county, the other was at the level of the city. And, made a couple statements and so on. And one of the things that I really learned from that was that first of all, you have to build relationships with people that when you kind of show up and just speak, they don't know who you are, and they're not really going to be moved by that unless they're just very sort of compassionate people. That was one point. And the other thing that I realized was that even with all the emotion in the room, and we had children there speaking about their experiences, and again, we had a very strong case for why they should have passed a resolution calling for a ceasefire. We had a very strong case. But ultimately, that case was dismissed because at the end of the day, for this particular city council, they were about, they wanted to kind of keep the status quo in place. We had a mayor that was going to Israel and kind of doing partnerships with Israeli police and what have you, and the military. So we realized that people in these positions of power, even at the level of the local city council, that when they're in that position, they become desensitized, honestly, to people's sort of suffering, people's concerns. Before we showed up as a Muslim community with some interfaith allies like Jewish Voice for Peace and others, before we showed up, you had African American, like Black Lives Matter activists there every single week by themselves speaking to the issues without any support from us. So I learned a lot from that we can't be in our silos, we can't be detached. But I also said, when people ask me, why did you bother? Because one meeting, we were there literally, I think all night. It felt like it, honestly. We got there at like 5 and we didn't get out till midnight. And someone said, why are you doing this? And I said, look, I'm not trying to change these people's hearts, because you can see how, you could look at them and tell how hard their hearts are. I said that Zaynab Ansari, that I did this so that when I stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I can say, oh Allah, I tried to do something. This is what I was able to do. I tried to do this. Honestly, that's why I'm doing this. And for the rest of you, if you are blessed to be able to kind of convince people, may Allah bless and accept. But if you're not able to, you are doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that our brothers and sisters will know that we did not ignore their pain and their suffering.